Welcome to our new program about New York City. I'm Brian Lehrer. Before we put our minds to local matters, our hearts lead us to other places. Las Vegas, where 58 were murdered, more than 500 injured by one man with some weapons that fire 90 rounds in 10 seconds. And there's Puerto Rico, still dark and thirsty, too devastated by Hurricane Maria to count the full losses to life and property. The Virgin Islands, similarly, from Hurricane Irma. And Mexico, 366 dead, thousands homeless from the earthquakes. And all of this in the past few weeks. Because everyone's not in a position to toss paper towels directly to those in need, later in the broadcast we'll list some ways the rest of us can send appropriate aid. All right, on to New York, a wonderful town. Creative, compassionate, diverse, full of opportunity, but it can also be cruel and dysfunctional and worse. But it tries to do better. And that's where this program resides, at the intersection of city politics and everyday life. I myself grew up in Queens, but I know all 5 boroughs pretty well. My parents encouraged me to travel. And I will have help from a rotating group of scholars, city officials, journalists, and others. On today's agenda, the November 7th election will examine Mayor Bill De Blasio's record and what 4 more years might bring, a conversation that will lead us to many issues. We are honored to have at our table City Council member Jumaane Williams, who represents Brooklyn's 45th District. That's Canarsie, East Flatbush, Flatlands, Marine Park, and Midwood. Also here, Joseph Viteretti, chair of Hunter College's Urban Policy and Planning Department. He's just published The Pragmatist, Bill de Blasio's quest to save the soul of New York. And I'm pleased Nicole Gelinas could make it as well. She's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of After the Fall, Saving Capitalism from New York and Washington. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for coming in.
Congratulations on your maiden voyage.
Thank you. So the mayor beat a field of other Democrats in 2013, positioning himself as the most progressive candidate and running on a Tale of Two Cities crusader against inequality platform. How much would each of you say he has governed as a progressive, and has he actually reduced inequality in the city to any degree? Councilman, want to start?
So I think to many people's chagrin, even on the left and the right, people have to admit that there have been some huge successes. And I try to say not necessarily income inequality, resource inequality. There's just a huge resource inequality and a divide. And I think you have to admit that he has had some historic changes there, whether it's pre-K, whether it's police reform, even in housing. At the same time, there are folks who believe you have to look at what he had the ability to accomplish and what isn't. And so even within the police reform successes, things like transparency and accountability, there's just no movement there, and one of them has moved backwards. When it comes to things like housing, there are achievements there, but not necessarily the people who needed it the most. And so there are places where we thought we would be further based on what happened in 2013, and we're not there. And there's no real explanation for that. And my hope is, I've endorsed him, and my hope is in the next few years, hopefully some of the political machinations that prevented that will be freed up a little bit.
That distinction that you made at the beginning between income and resources, flesh that out a little bit. Why is that important?
I think it's important to talk about income inequality, but I believe we'll probably always have income inequality. I don't think everybody's going to make the same income, but there are resources that I think people need to live a fairly substantial life that people don't have access to. And so forget about if you have a mansion, if you don't have a house at all. I think regardless of what income you have, you should have a safe, affordable place to live. You should have decent food on your table. You should have access to health care and schools. And so that is an inequality I think we can address.
Nicole Gelinas, governed as a progressive, dented inequality?
Well, he hasn't dented inequality in terms of how much people make. The mayor says that himself every year in his budget presentation. And indeed, the mayor depends on inequality and depends on 40,000 people paying half of the city's income taxes in order to fund a much larger government than it was 3 years ago. He's increased the city budget by about $11 billion over the past 4 years. A lot of that went toward retroactive raises for public employees. But on the resource issue, I think there's a lot of places that he's fallen down. For example, there's nothing wrong with construction of condominium buildings, apartment towers, and so forth for the wealthy. There is something wrong when these towers are built out of scale to their neighborhoods, when they cast shadows on public parks that everyone uses, whether you're wealthy and you live near the park, you're middle class, you're poor. These shadows affect everyone's enjoyment of public spaces. Same thing with helicopter noise, same thing with traffic, quality of life on the city streets, where these are the places where everyone is almost in the same boat, and the mayor has not done very simple things like zoning changes and much better control over the traffic on the streets to improve everybody's life.
When you say the mayor depends on inequality because the rich pay a lot of the taxes, you're not arguing that he's actually trying to keep it that way, are you?
Well, it's debate. It's kind of academic because there's not very much he can practically do about it. And I think he's aware of that. That New York is unequal because wealthy people want to live here. If you have the editors of major publications, major magazines want to live on Fifth Avenue, make a lot of money. If they leave, the city will be more equal, but that doesn't do anybody any good if these places take their jobs with them and so forth. And so there are things we can fix, things we can't fix. I don't think we're ever going to fix the fact that New York is unequal, nor to some extent would we want to, if that means becoming a place where people with resources don't want to choose to live here.
Yeah, and I think he's mostly about bringing up the bottom rather than trying to make people poorer, though certainly he wants a tax hike on the top 1%. But Joe Viteretti, your book is called The Pragmatist, your book about de Blasio, and yet I think the general perception of him is that he's an ideologue, which doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. A lot of people like his ideology, progressivism as he would define it. But why the pragmatist?
I think he has a bifurcated personality. There's a piece of him that's very ideological, progressive. If you go back into his history, which I do, goes back to even third-party labor movements. He's a pragmatist in the sense that he's, in addition to being what was an activist, he jumped into the political processes and trying to make things work. And in answer to your first question, if you look at the numbers, things are moving in the right direction. Unemployment is down, poverty is down, earnings are up, there's more housing being built. He's invested more money in housing and homelessness than any mayor in history. The crime rate is down, the arrest rate is down, stop, question, and frisk is down, police complaints are down. So things are certainly moving in a direction that is very much in line with what he said he wanted to do. He ran as a progressive. He was the only one, other than John Liu, who was taken out of the campaign early because of some campaign finance issues. He ran as the only real progressive who ran against the Bloomberg legacy. And he ran on a platform of economic inequality. And I think for the most part, what he's done reflects that. Not everybody's happy with the progress, but he certainly has moved in the direction he said he wanted. We looked at, when we were doing the book, I asked the Independent Budget Office to look at spending. And if you look at redistributive services that go to poor people, there's definitely an increase in that. I mean, so the numbers are there to support it.
Just one thing, something that Nicole touched on, even though, and we did hear wages are up, but we have to make sure we talk about money in the household. So it's not just income, it is the pre-K, it is the rent freezes, it is all of those things that helped keep money in households that have to be counted as well.
So how does one run against a mayor who has done all the things that you just heard, leading to some satisfaction among a fair percentage of the city? Here is an example. Republican candidate Nicole Gelinas released this commercial.
What's it like riding the subway under Bill de Blasio? A lot like this. A nightmare. 3/4 of subway lines are now plagued by delays. That's over 70,000 delays a month. People are packed in like sardines, and subway sex crimes are up over 50%. While we deal with this, Bill De Blasio is being chauffeured to his gym miles away. New Yorkers deserve better, and I'm going to fight every day to make sure they get it.
Paid for by Nicole from New York City.
So, our Nicole, I don't know if you want to endorse her on the basis of Nicole identity politics, but I could have thought that was a commercial against against Andrew Cuomo, because the state runs the subways, not the city. What do you think of that?
Right. I think it's reasonable for the other Nicole to criticize de Blasio for not paying enough attention to the transit crisis. Now, to be fair to the mayor, the transit crisis didn't start under his watch. We've been adding population to the city now for 35 years. We haven't been adding transit capacity. We had a lot of extra capacity thanks to the people who built the subways starting a century ago and until the 1930s, but we've run out of extra capacity. So would it be wise for the city to set aside some of its record surplus money for strategic investments in transit? Sure, but what Cuomo has been asking for and what de Blasio has been resisting is for the city essentially to just bail out the MTA. In other words, the MTA hasn't been doing its job. They haven't been inspecting train cars enough. A lot of these breakdowns were avoidable. It faces a huge deficit because it hasn't managed its cost. And now the governor sees these things and goes to the city and says, hey, give us $400 million with no real reforms, no changes, and no indication that the city won't have to make this payment again. So that's not a good idea.
And de Blasio kind of said yes after he said no, as long as he could tax the 1% to do it.
Right, which makes it even more complicated. Again, not a good idea. The MTA needs capital investment in the long term, but first they really need to reform how they spend this money. And Nicole hasn't said exactly how she wants to fix the transit system, and hopefully that's one of the things that will come up in more detail at the debate next week.
And go ahead.
It's an odd issue to grab onto, though, if you're running for mayor, because it is primarily a state issue. I mean, what they're going to quibble about is how much the mayor at some point might be asked to put in, and at some point he may have to come up with something.
But I wonder what percentage of New Yorkers realize that the state runs the MTA.
That's the thing. So as an ad, it's a great ad. As we were talking before the show starts, sometimes facts don't matter. So people know that they can't get to work. That's it. They sometimes don't know who's responsible. Surprisingly, Nicole here, and I agree a lot on what she said, because it is a state entity. It is a state's responsibility. On top of what was said, the city has minimal power over what happens there. I think it's a 14 or 15 member board, and we have maybe 4 seats. Actually, a large part of the MTA budget does already come from the city. So they want additional money without the reforms, and not even additional controls from the city. And so it's not factual, and it's not a real way to get change, and Nicole Gelinas knows that. But in terms of trying to muddy up the facts, it's a good ad. My hope is that it doesn't get muddied, because this is really Cuomo's MTA.
And one final point is you mentioned correctly, both of you, that the city does not run the transit system, but until Bloomberg came along, the city had, the mayoralty had very little control over the education system. So one could make a case that the city should control the transit system. You're right to say that the city taxpayers pay more than 60% of the MTA's taxes, and they pay an even bigger share of fare revenue. So could one run for mayor saying the city should keep this revenue and control these investments? Sure, but again, we're not seeing that, or at least we're not seeing it yet.
But I think even the mayor would agree with that. Like, if we can say we control it, yeah. But remember, Bloomberg had to go to Albany to get that. It wasn't that he woke up and snapped his finger. That was a whole long process.
Right.
That I think any mayor, anybody who's there would say, if you're going to give me the power, that makes sense.
Abe Beam was the first mayor to say, let me control the schools. That's how long it took
to get that control.
Yeah.
So here we are, about a month before an election, with no drama. Nobody actually, among the pollsters and political analysts, thinks this is going to be close. And yet we constantly hear, oh, nobody likes de Blasio. but we just ran down. People have pre-K, paid sick leave, crime is down, stop and frisk is down. You said he's spending more on affordable housing than anybody in recorded history, whatever. So what's the disconnect? Is this a media disconnect? Why do we hear he's serving all these constituencies? No Democrat of major stature wanted to run against him. Malliotakis has no chance, but nobody likes him.
There are a lot
What's
of things.
the
There are a
disconnect?
lot of things going on. First of all, nobody wants to run against him because he has a wall of defense around him that's built by organized labor. And if you have organized labor in a primary, you've won the election. So that's one issue. It's not that nobody likes him. He's below 50% on his approval rating. I think there are a lot of things going on there. I think that approval rating for politicians is down generally because people have lost faith in government and politics. And there's good reason to, because as Bernie Sanders said, the system is rigged and people understand that. That's number one. Number two, I think the investigations did not help his image as a reformer because, here he comes in with a progressive pedigree that's genuine and sincere. And that kind of muddies the water a bit and reflects negatively on him in a system, that I think that has brought some criticism on him.
You mentioned the investigations. I want to play a clip of video on the issue of corruption. As some of you watching know, former state Senate leader Dean Skelos, who had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for bribery, extortion, and conspiracy, had his felony convictions erased this past week by a federal appeals court. This came 2 months after former Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver was spared 12 years in prison when the Court of Appeals overturned his bribery conviction. In both rulings, judges cited last year's decision by the U.S. Supreme Court that threw out the conviction of former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell and established a narrower definition of what corruption is. At a forum held at CUNY Law School a week before the Skelos reversal, I had a chance to ask former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara, who oversaw these cases and was later fired by President Trump, why precisely the Silver verdict was invalidated. It had to do with a small detail in the judge's summation to the jury. Here's Preet's 2-minute answer.
With respect to the Sheldon Silver case, we had the misfortune of having tried the case under a particular theory, which was all 100% good and smart and common sense law, and then the Supreme Court decides, in a case that some people have said was a naive decision, that you can take Rolexes if you're the governor of a state, and if all you do is set up meetings for someone who's a constituent who gave you those Rolexes, and I'm simplifying a little bit, that's not criminal. And it changed the law to the degree, a little bit. We believe that I don't know how many people followed the case, we had overwhelming evidence that Sheldon Silver accepted money, the quid, and he did in exchange for official actions, the quo. And most of that official action, the lion's share of that official action, would have been absolutely illegal, even under this new Supreme Court case, the McDonnell case. It was giving grants to various parties, financial grants to various parties using his legislative power. It was voting in a particular way. That's quintessentially, under any version of the law before or after McDonald, that's official action. It used to also be the law that something that's a little bit more mundane, like setting up a meeting for a constituent, might also violate the law. That was also a potential official action and a quo. So what the Supreme Court said is that may not be sufficient. And our prosecutors, not knowing that the law would change after doing the argument in the case, in a couple of instances, in the summation and in the rebuttal summation, made reference to the fact that on top of all this other stuff that was official action on the part of Sheldon Silver, he also did these meetings. And like that itself could be sufficient to sustain a conviction. And because that little bit that was not the central part of the case, which was sort of gravy in the case, if I can use that term, was the basis that the judges said it could be that some juror convicted on that basis alone, and that narrow basis that was the holding in the McDonnell case means that we have to retry.
So basically you now go back, don't include that piece,
Correct.
and present mostly the same evidence, and you think he'll be convicted again?
That is my hope, expectation, and to me, that would be justice.
So we will see what happens, and if it turns out that way, and if Silver and now Scalos get reconvicted in the way that Preparara just described. So Nicole Gelinas, I want to get your take on how that relates to the Bill de Blasio case, because that was one of the main things that was going on during this term of his. There was this investigation by Preparara and a related one by the Manhattan DA, Cy Vance. Ultimately, they decided not to indict, but Cy Vance issued a critical report about the fundraising practices and suggesting that there may even have been favors done that were just this side of the law to some of those donors. Is this a de Blasio problem, or is this a problem with our campaign finance system?
Well, obviously, we have to prosecute corruption, but we shouldn't rely on the criminal justice system to do what should be done through the electoral system. The facts are out there about what de Blasio did and didn't do, as you noted. Voters have ample ability to evaluate this and decide weigh this against what they may think of him doing as good and decide whether they want to elect him again. But to have that choice, you need a good, diverse group of candidates. And it's, as you mentioned, not a lot of people running against de Blasio this year. 4 years ago, we were sitting here. We did have a serious Democratic primary based on the issues. And this year, we haven't had very much of that. And so it's a combination of both the problems with the court cases as well as people not having very good choices when it comes to a purer person, if you will, that might achieve some of the same goals that they want to see achieved.
Yeah. And Councilman, remind me, you chair the Committee on Housing?
Housing buildings.
And some of these donations came from real estate developers and other people in the real estate industry. Is there too much real estate influence in city government based on the amount of money that they spread around?
I mean, obviously, yes. Like the real estate controls folks, and more even in Albany, because those folks make decisions on housing policies. They have no constituents that can give them feedback on that. They're all in New York City, and those folks don't represent New York City. And so that is a catastrophe there in of itself. About the case that you spoke about, I think everybody, once the Sheldon Silver one was overturned, everybody expected the Scalos one to be overturned. And that's disappointing because everybody knows it was immoral, unethical. The criminal part, I guess, there was a disconnect, and I think Preet described it perfectly. Everybody expects that there'll be another trial. And I think just even with the part that's carved out, there's enough there. I just want to make sure I put on the record, someone like me, and it should frustrate everyone, the most frustrating part is everybody knows what those two folks did were unethical, immoral, and are bad for government. And they're walking free. There are a lot of young black and Latino, usually males, who are sitting in prison for marijuana crimes, let's say. As we're legalizing marijuana, no one's going back to even make sure that they're corrected as we're doing that. And so those type of things are very frustrating.
But what is that real estate money buying that's not in the public interest?
Well, in Albany, so people are making decisions that are very harmful to tenants. They're very harmful to achieve our housing goals here in New York City, things around rent regulation, which I know Nicole's not the biggest fan of, but those decisions are being made based on who pays the most money in Albany. And we in New York City, people think have a lot of control over it. There's something called the Erstat law that prevents us from making decisions. The problem is we can't even vote them out because those senators in Albany, senators and assembly members who have no rent-regulated tenants, for example, in their districts, we can't even do anything about it.
Real estate money goes to people who don't represent New York,
Yes.
who might be friendly to the real estate donors' interests.
Yes.
On regulation that affects New York.
Absolutely.
And where's Governor Cuomo in this, Joe Viteretti? I mean, one of the mysteries of the last 4 years of why these guys who used to work together in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, who share more or less the same political views, they overlap mostly, why they seem to be biting each other's backs all the time.
I think, obviously, it goes without saying they're not fond of each other. I think there's something more to it that needs more attention, and that is they're two very basically, very different politically and philosophically. Andrew Cuomo is a mainstream, middle-of-the-road Democrat. Bill de Blasio wants to push the party to the left, and there are clear philosophical differences between them. And it comes up with things like a minimum wage law, which, you know, Bill kind of pushed, and eventually Andrew went along with. These kinds of things come up all the time. And
But
I
those
think
are
there's real
agreements. I mean, that's maybe the most baffling part.
Can I say it in more stark terms? Because I honestly believe when it comes to political machinations, the mayor and Cuomo are actually similar in some of those things. The difference I see, and I want to be clear, is I believe that the mayor has a core, and it is a progressive core, sort of what he was saying. I think the only core that the governor have is what's best for him and where he can go, and the power that he can achieve. And I think that's a very stark difference, and it causes some of the bashing that's going on, and some of them are trying to occupy the same space.
How much do you agree with that, Nicole?
I think it comes down to the fact that there can only be one person who gets national attention out of New York, and that's going to be focused on New York City. And Bill de Blasio thought it would be him during the presidential campaign. Cuomo may want it to be him if he's thinking of running for higher office. And so no matter what it is they're doing, whether it's minimum wage, infrastructure investments, Cuomo's funding of pre-K and not the way that de Blasio wanted, only one of them can claim credit for it.
Tensions between mayors and governors are not new. Rockefeller and Lindsay despised each other.
Right.
Ed Koch and Mario did not like each other very much. So there's a
point.
history here.
We have like 20 seconds left, or about a minute maybe. I'm just curious if any of you think there's an act 2 for, you know, the inequality, tale of two cities fighter, progressive mayor. I don't think I'm hearing brand name proposals like pre-K, ending stop and frisk, paid sick leave, are we?
We're not. I think what you're going to see more is Bill talking more to a national audience and trying to move the party more to the left. I think that the real battle ahead is to decide what the future of the Democratic Party is, and people like him and Bernie Sanders are going to try to move in that direction.
But that would indicate that he may take his eye off the ball of the city.
Well, my hope is
because he's term limited after this election if he gets reelected.
Sure. My hope is that it frees him up to do things like universal summer youth jobs, like deal with the transparency and accountability issue, like really drill down on the 40-something% of people who are very low and low income when it comes to housing. So I think there is an Act 2. It's clear that there has been achievements, and we can't denounce that. But I think the Act 2 hopefully will be even greater than the first Act.
Nicole, 15 seconds, last word.
Act 2, if history is any guide, could also involve him dealing with a real emergency. He's been very lucky in that the economy has stayed strong, but this is one of the longest economic expansions in history. No mayor has gone through 2 terms without a budget crisis, and so how he responds to that would be interesting.
Thank you all very much for coming to our table. I really appreciate it. One more important matter, how to donate money and goods for earthquake relief in Mexico and hurricane relief in Puerto Rico. Here's a list of organizations. They're also on this program's Twitter feed at Brian Talks NY. Many organizations recommend donating money, but if you wish to send goods such as diapers, batteries, and baby food, certain fire and EMS stations in each borough are collection points. You can call 311 to find the drop-off point nearest you. Next time on the program, we'll react to the mayoral debate scheduled for next Tuesday. Bill de Blasio faces Republican Nicole Maliotakis and independent candidate Bo Dietl. I'll be one of the questioners. City Council member Adonis Rodriguez will join our panel next week, along with Crane's columnist Greg David. By the way, if you're not yet registered to vote on November 7th, the deadline is near October 13th. Directing traffic at the hazardous intersection of city politics and everyday life, I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.